See, I've got a 2.5-year-old, and we have a weekly tradition, a weekly routine where we go to Bunnings. I know these are decorative, but Pastor Sharon, I'm sorry, they did look beautiful, but I can't do it. And so we have this weekly routine. I bring my 2.5-year-old to Bunnings every week, and he's a great little talker, but he can't pronounce words, maybe as articulately as he needs to, and I'm a bit the same this morning. And he likes to get snacks when he goes to Bunnings. Snacks. Snacks. But he ignores the N, and he pronounced the A more like an E. So we're going through Bunnings, and he starts shouting out at the top of his voice, "Sex, sex, sex, daddy, daddy!" And I try to like back away. I get all like red and hot and flustered. I kind of point to the other customers and I say, he gets this from his mom. And but the truth is that sometimes we come to church and we hear the word sex, and we kind of have that same reaction. We kind of go, we can't talk about that here. This isn't the right place. This isn't the right context. But God talks a lot about sex. He's quite passionate about the issue.
Certainly is.
So this morning, we're going to go there. We're going to ask a few questions. And like I said, thank you so much for sharing. Doctor, psychotherapist, I had to write this down. Doctor, psychotherapist, pastor, counselor, psychologist, all-round legend. Dee, you have quite a number of impressive titles. Tell us about how you acquired them all.
Well, I guess the place to start is honouring my wonderful husband, because you can't do this sort of thing and have a family and a life and everything unless you've got support. And, Michael did everything from sort of housewife type duties to reading my assignments and making corrections to going to the library and looking things up for me, and I can't, the list goes on, but I have to honour him, because without him it would have been impossible.
Wow, yeah.
And also doors, doors open to me that should never have been opened. I remember one thing I applied to do, there was something like 600 applicants and 40 places, and I was not as qualified as many of the people there, but God called me to this ministry, and He's opened lots of doors for me. So I've been very fortunate, lots of support from all sorts of areas. But what I want to say is that those titles all sound really wonderful, but I prefer to be known as a servant of the Most High God. That's my most important job.
Awesome. And as you mentioned, Michael is here with us today. Thank you so much for your support and for releasing Dee to be here this morning. But Dee, tell us a little bit about your family and when you first met Michael. Get us to introduce us to your family and your marriage.
There I was in London, and this unusual rock musician came into my life with bright red hair down to his waist and a huge beard, and swept me off my feet, basically. And when he asked me questions, in my head was no, but out of my mouth came yes. Like, will you come to Australia with me? Yes. Will you? Yes. And I've been saying yes for 46 years, I think.
Wow.
Subsequently, 6 children, 11 grandchildren, and a great-grandson.
Do you miss the hair?
I've still got pictures.
Dee, how do you keep your relationship thriving?
Well, I think the big thing for us is, it's communication. Men and women speak a different language. Men internalise, women externalise. So you have to learn to actually talk to each other. I think that's the main thing. We need to ask each other what each other needs, and part of that is acceptance. Accepting the differences and. Not judging those differences, but trying to accommodate them. And I think, we have to accept that we are different. People aren't going to be the same. And living in an environment where people are very different takes a bit of doing. So it's about really talking to each other. And remember that the scriptures tell us in Ephesians 4:15 and 16, instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of Him who is the head, that is Christ. For him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. So it is work, but it's worth it. And we often, hear people say, oh, get real and be authentic. But, we're often a bit scared to do that. And unless we tell people what we really need and what we really feel, we can't get along. And speaking kindly, I think, is important. Yeah. Again, Romans 12:9 and 11 says, don't just pretend to love others, really love them. Hate what's wrong, hold tightly to what's good, and love each other with genuine affection. Take delight in honouring each other. Never be lazy, but work hard to serve the Lord enthusiastically. Another thing is forgiveness. We need to actually practice forgiveness. It's not an easy thing. It doesn't come naturally. And Colossians 3:12 and 14, therefore, as God's chosen people, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive because the Lord forgave you. If we keep on remembering just how much we get forgiven every day, it becomes easier to forgive one another. And, we've got to take the judgment thing out of it.
Wow. Yeah.
Because we are all different. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds us together in perfect unity. So we have to kind of let go of the past. Often I think we bring up past hurts and things, and they don't help. So Philippians 3:13 says, forgetting the things which are behind and reaching forth unto those things that are before. And, it's just going forward. And I think, Princess Diana was very famous for saying that there were 3 people in her marriage. And for her, that was a negative thing. But for those of us that are fortunate enough to be married, we're blessed with that too. There are 3 people in our marriage, and one of them's called the Lord Jesus. Yeah. And he makes one big difference.
Absolutely. And this is, this is real treasure that we're hearing, real gold that we're hearing today, because you're a couple that not just have been married for some time, but are more in love today than ever before, as you proudly declare to everyone around you. Yeah. And so, this is something that I know I'm taking on board as a relatively young married man. Yes. So thank you so much for sharing. All right, for the next set of questions, please bear in mind that we have 12-year-olds in the room as well as my mother-in-law. So try not to make it too awkward for me, but we're going to talk about sex. So where do we start? Okay, well, of all the commandments that God has given us, there is one that we have not only not broken, but we've actually done exceedingly well in. And that was the command to be fruitful and to multiply. I think we've done that very successfully, and God would be proud of us. Why are we so good at it? What's the purpose of it, and what makes us so successful at it?
Well, I think I'd like to start to tell you a story. Who knows who the first man on the moon was? No one? Neil Armstrong. Does anybody know what he said? They're all sort of mumbling there, but I think they've got it right. But he also said something else. He said, good luck, Mr. Gavorski, so, directly after he said that. And when he landed, people were, obviously asking him all sorts of things, and they kept on asking what was that all about, and he wouldn't say. And some years later, somebody did a magazine article on him and remembered this and asked him about it. And he said, well, actually, I can tell you now because Mr. Gavorski is no longer with us. When I was a young boy, I used to play basketball in my backyard with my friends and my brother. And he said one day the ball went over next door's fence. And so being a very adventurous young man, he climbed the fence to go next door to retrieve his ball. And as he got over the fence and walked towards the house where the ball had rolled, he heard Mr. and Mrs. Gavorski having a terrible row, really shouting at each other. And as he got closer to the house, he heard Mrs. Gavorski shout out, sex? You want sex? You can have sex when the boy next door walks on the moon. Good luck, Mr. Gavorski.
Beautiful. How do we pick up from here, Dee?
Okay, well, I think it's a funny story, but it tells us that a lot of us don't have the right attitude. You know, Mrs. Gavolsky didn't have the right attitude, bless her heart. But let's look at what God's got to say about it.
Very good.
Genesis 2:21 said, "The Lord caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs, and then he closed up this place with flesh." Verse 24 says, "That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." Soon after God created the world, he saw that man was alone. He needed companionship. So God created woman, and the Bible says that Adam lay with his wife, or that Adam knew his wife.
Wow.
And knew is an Old English word, of course, for sexual intercourse. So one of the first things Adam said about this wondrous gift was that she was flesh of my flesh. And there's lots of references in the scriptures about the two becoming one. So clearly, the union between man and woman is not purely for procreation, but to actually bind them together. So they're created to be in union with one another. And I guess that one flesh isn't just the sexual union, but the fact that a married couple should live in a state of harmony, intimacy, and mutual support for one another. So godly sex is a way of communicating that love, and it goes beyond words. And it's designed to develop over a lifetime of mutual love and understanding. Like good wine, sex gets better with age, I'm happy to say. And it expresses and deepens that one flesh bonding as a gift from God for our pleasure and enjoyment within the confines of marriage. So that bond continues on the journey called marriage, and we start to really behave sometimes and think as one. When one gets hurt, the other one gets hurt. When somebody attacks you, he or she feels attacked as well. Every tear that's shed is precious to the other person. And you rejoice in each other's victories, and you start to live in the true unity that God intended.
Wow.
And so it's like heart to heart, soul to soul, and body to body. And so to me, it's like when we have those intimate times with the Lord, when we're either in prayer or worship, it's the sense of that intimacy with God is overwhelming. It's like it's euphoric. It's like something nothing else can replace. You know, it's just wonderful, and we can measure it scientifically because it actually creates endorphins, which creates serotonin, which nourishes our brain, and we like it and we want more of it. And that same thing happens when we're experiencing a sexual relationship. We release those same endorphins that create that serotonin, and it bonds us together in a really joyous way. And Ephesians 5 is that classic example of Christ comparing his relationship with the church with the relationship between man and a woman.
Well, yep, awesome. Well, I guess Pastor Mitch asked me many questions in regard to today, but this was not one of them. I'll just clarify that. But Pastor Mitch is a young, engaged man. 15th of February, will be getting married. But like I said, this was not from him. I'm just clarifying this was definitely not from him or his fiancée. But I guess, you know, we've talked about how sex is a great thing. God's created it. He's designed it. It's not just for procreation, but it's also for pleasure, and it's also to unite the couple. Why then is it only for married couples? But, you know, what about an engaged couple? I mean, they're going to get married anyway. Why can't they sleep with each other before marriage? What does the Bible have to say?
Well, I think the Bible is very clear that sexual love God designs it within the confines of marriage. I think there's many, many scriptures that support that. But yeah, people, often think, well, we're getting married anyway and blah, blah, blah. But, think about the parable of the man who built his house on the sand compared to the man who dug deep and laid the foundations on a rock. When the floods came, the torrent struck that house, but nothing could shake it because it was well built. But the moment the torrent struck the other man's house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete. And you can read about that in Luke 7:46-49. So there's your guarantee, young people. Build your marriage on the rock, whose name is Jesus. Resist the lie of the devil, and he will flee from you. But, don't put yourself in a position where you can be tempted in the first place. I think the dichotomy I see going on is that people are so afraid of being alone together that they don't actually get to know each other very well. So I think you have to sort of have a meaningful relationship with somebody and actually get to know them. So it's actually important to be alone together, but not in private places. So, have those really deep and meaningful conversations, but have them in a park, go for a picnic or a walk, have them in a restaurant or a coffee shop, but have other people around, not necessarily friends that are talking at the same time, just you two having conversations where you get to know each other, but where there are other people. And particularly as the relationship deepens, make sure that you are never alone, because there's always the temptation to be in private places. So don't sit for long periods of time in a car alone together. Don't stay home alone together when mum and dad are out, because that temptation is real, very real, but it's resistible if you're diligent.
Fantastic. Oh, the other thing I'd just throw in there as well is there's a difference between intention and commitment. And if I were to buy a house, I could see the for sale sign in front of that house. I can have every intention to buy it. But if I enter into that house, it's actually me breaking in. But if I actually pay for that house and I get the title deed, there's a commitment there. There is a contract. And marriage isn't just a contract. It's actually a covenant. It's something that's made before God and before man. And it's a declaration that till death do us part, we are committed to each other, and it's in that safe place. I think that marriage creates a safe place that I can be completely vulnerable, completely open, and completely one with my spouse, and there's a freedom and a power and a joy that comes and can only be found in that relationship. So I believe that's the heart of God when it comes to sex. So there's your question answered, Pastor Mitch.
And I think don't feel guilty about the temptation, because it's a natural instinct. I think that's another thing. Sometimes people feel guilty that they have those feelings, but they're natural, but you just have to kind of contain them. Yep, absolutely.
Well, one of the issues that I guess is very, very prevalent today is the area of pornography. And it has an effect, obviously, on the individual, but it goes beyond just an individual. So what are the impacts that pornography is having on the individual, upon the relationships, and upon the world at large, I suppose?
Well, you're certainly right. It's rampant, and its tentacles sort of invade our lives through advertising, media, in the hope of making us immune to the evil that it represents. So we see advertisements for sex toys. The best-selling books around these days are full of pornography, sadism and masochism. And this denigration of human love is not God's intention, and can never bring the fulfillment that we find in a godly relationship between a man and a woman. So we need to protect our thoughts from the lies of the devil. So, times have changed, and we see much more inappropriate sex than we used to. We never used to hear bad language on television and movies. We never used to see nudities or those sorts of things. Now you can see everything there is to see just about everywhere you look. And it's slowly chipping away at us. And I'm going to tell you a story about that shortly. But, it's the focus is the wrong way round.
Yeah.
You know, the focus should always be on loving the other person. But pornography is about self-gratification and making sure I get what I want at any cost. And that's really devilish. It's absolutely not right. So it creates unrealistic expectations, and it's not the way that we're meant to go. We're meant to go the way of agape, sort of unconditional love towards each other.
Yeah.
And you know, even the Word of God actually says that our husbands should nail themselves to the cross. You know, lay down your life for your wife the way that Christ laid down his life for us. So to our human reasoning, that seems impossible. But God never asks us to do stuff that we can't do. You know, if we're willing, he gives us the ability to do it. Now, that seems to me you can't do that. But I've seen it done, and I enjoy the benefits of it personally. So, you know, we can be that way. And you know, the more that we do that, the more those things I've talked about, those chemicals get released. So it's a scientific thing. You know, there's lots of things that our body does that we don't even realise happen. God's really clever. He does all these amazing things, and we don't even realise. Like, for example, one of my favourite things is when we cry tears of grief, our tear ducts release an opiate to make us feel better. You know, and I could sit here and tell you a lot, but I'll be going off on a tangent. But our God is really good and looks after us in lots of ways. You know, 1 John 4:12 says, no one has ever seen God, but if we love each other, God lives in us, and his love is brought to full expression in us.
Wow. Yeah.
Great promise.
Absolutely. So I guess as parents, and I'm not at this stage yet, but when my kids come to be teenagers, we've got parents here of teenagers at the moment. What can parents do to help protect the next generation?
Mm-hmm. Well, talk, teach, and protect. So talk about it.
Wow.
You know, we don't often talk about sex. Kids get reproduction training in schools. They don't get sex education. We need to actually talk about it. And it's not kind of the sit them down and have the talk. You know, it's just make it a natural thing to talk about. Incidentally, Orthodox Jews, I don't know if we've got any here, but, you know, they celebrate the Sabbath, and part of their Sabbath worship, they consider sort of making love to be an act of worship. So because they include it in their Sabbath worship, they want to make it as good as they possibly can. So the men teach their sons how to pleasure their future wives, and the wives do the same with their daughters. And we, you know, we shouldn't look to schools to teach our children these things.
Yeah.
It should come from a godly perspective. It should come from us. So talk about it and tell them how wonderful and beautiful it is, and that it's something that they can look forward to. You know, don't push it under the carpet, because they're going to find that, they're going to look for that knowledge in the wrong place, and we don't want that.
Yeah.
So talk and teach them and protect them from those things that are there, you know, to tempt them away. Don't let them watch those programs that have got these things, bad language and explicit things in them. You know, protect them from it.
Very good.
And fill those spaces with other interesting things from them. If you take something away, then you've got to put something in its place.
Very good. Yeah, absolutely. I think the lesson, I think, for parents and you know, for working amongst youth, for youth leaders as well, is to not be attach shame to sex. It's not a shameful thing. It's a celebrating thing. It's something that's great in its right place, and I think that's the most important foundation for any parent to start the conversation. Where do we go from here? What do we do? I guess this one in a short answer. But what can we do if we're stuck in the habit of pornography? How do we break free from that? How do we find freedom?
Okay, well, I want to tell you a story, but let me just sort of say that homosexuality particularly and pornography and all of those things are becoming more and more rampant. And so, you know, we need to realise that these things, it's like almost like a dripping tap. Drip, 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 you know, as more of it, you know, we're exposed to more of it. It breaks down those barriers, you know, and so we, you know, there's so much around that it makes us immune to it. So we have to just stop exposing ourselves to it, basically.
Yeah.
Shall I tell my sky-like story?
Why don't you share the story?
Yes, okay. I'm going to abbreviate this story, but this is, I've taken this from somebody else's book, basically. So, you know, this is a story of a skylark. And one day, this beautiful skylark is just chirping away, flying through the sky, and she sees a merchant saying, worms, juicy worms for feathers. And so she goes along and she looks at these worms, and they're big and fat and juicy, bigger than she's ever had before. And so she thinks, oh, this is good. So she plucks out a feather and swaps it, and she selects 2 juicy worms, and off she goes, really happy. And the next day she goes, and the next day she goes, and the next day she goes, and the next day she goes. And so it goes on. This is really easy. It's better than digging up really skinny little worms that I have to dig hard for, until one day she goes to fly away and she can't fly. And why can't she fly? Because she's fat. She's put on so much weight from eating all these worms. And also she's plucked out all of her feathers. Oh, and so she goes back to where she used to get the feathers, the worms from, and digs and digs and digs, and fills up a big palm frond with all these worms and drags them back to the merchant and says, oh, please give me back my feathers. And he just laughs with a twinkle in his eye and says, I'm in the business of feathers for worms. I'm in the business of worms for feathers. And how are you going to stick them back on again? And with that, he snatches away her worms, because he can fatten them up and make them into juicy ones, and locks them in a cage, and with a click of his fingers, they've disappeared. So that's how it is. It's just that drip, 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 that exposure.
And that's the, I guess, the pattern for all sorts of addictions, from drug addiction, alcohol, but then also in the area of sexuality as well.
Yeah.
Very powerful story. Well, you mentioned homosexuality. Let's talk a little bit about that. It's becoming more and more mainstream in certainly Western culture, more accepted. Why is the church so resistant to this, given that that we're told that people are born gay, born that way?
Mm-hmm. Well, God doesn't make any mistakes. And we can't just say we're born a certain way. We have to be able to prove it scientifically. We have to do it, we can do it genetically. And people, there is not a genetic link in homosexuality.
Wow.
So it's people say they're born that way, but they're actually not. It's learned behaviour. Now, sometimes that behaviour is forced upon them, like, you know, sometimes an innocent young person is abused in a certain way, which creates that bad behaviour, but they're certainly not actually genetically born that way. And often it's this exposure. They're so exposed to it that, and it's normalised now as well. Yeah. And so, yes, it is. It's difficult. You know, if people find themselves locked in these sort of things, but you know, there is an answer. So it's not inborn. It's certainly a behaviour that's very compelling and compulsive, and it seems for the person locked into it impossible to change. But you know, and they stay locked into it at a very high cost to themselves. There's lots of ostracisation. Often people get beaten up. They can die because of the sexually transmitted diseases. But once people understand the biology of habit, and that it is a habit, they can start to do some things to change it. So compulsions and addictions feel like they're resistant to change, but they're not. We're not meant to be locked in that. We need to learn to fly again. And you know, this example of change can be applied to any addiction or habit. Learned behaviour can be unlearned, because we're more than conquerors. We're not meant to be digging up worms. We're meant to be flying like eagles.
Very good, very good. I think the other thing about homosexuality is we're told, the society will tell us that it's your identity. If you have a desire, you have an identity of being gay. And I guess in any other context, that's actually not true. I mean, if someone has a desire to consume large amounts of alcohol, but they resist that desire, we don't call them an alcoholic. If someone has a desire to steal from a bank, but they resist that desire, they're not a thief. If someone has a desire to kill their children, which from time to time, I think every parent in the room has had that moment, probably this week, that doesn't make us a murderer. It's about what we do with that desire. The Bible says, or Jesus himself said, that there is no temptation that's not common to man. All temptation is common to man, and it is something that he himself would have been tempted in, because he was tempted in every way, and yet he overcome. And yet, he didn't make it a part of his identity. So there's a real importance, I think, and this is where the church has a voice to say, just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean that defines who you are. I guess it's a great opportunity to ask a question that we don't normally get to ask, or look at an issue that we don't normally get to look at in church, and that is about the area of abuse. Obviously, God has intended sex to be wonderful, right confines, and everything is supposed to be wonderful, but some people have had very negative and unfair and abusive experiences with sex, and other areas as well, violence and so on and so forth. But what is abuse? How would you define it?
The easy answer to that really is boundaries. It's where somebody's boundaries have been broken down.
Wow.
And it's very difficult for them actually to rebuild them, particularly if it happens when they're a child.
Yeah.
So for about 15 or 16 years of my career, I actually specialised in adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And the good news is people get well.
Wow, yeah.
Because God is so very good.
Yeah.
But it's about, restoring those boundaries, healing of past hurts. But people can get well. But it's just, if a boundary is destroyed, it stays destroyed until you actually rebuild it. And so sometimes people don't realise they have this happen in their childhood or when they're young, and they just live the rest of their lives with often continued abuse. So it might not be big things, but it might be simply somebody pushing you out of the queue, or somebody, a shop assistant being rude to you. And you put up with those things because your boundaries have been broken.
Wow.
So the restoration, once somebody gets restored from the original thing, a whole new world of feeling good about themselves. It's just like a flower blossoming. It's just wonderful.
Well, so it's really, obviously when abuse happens, it's a devaluing, a demoralizing, and the restoration process is the exact opposite. It's that building up. It's that restoring of hope, restoring of value and self-worth. And obviously that's the approach that you take when ministering.
Yeah, and they become courageous too. You
Wow.
know, it's just lovely, yeah.
Fantastic. Obviously, you've worked with some pretty intense cases over the years. 16 years, you said, in this particular field, and would have heard some horror stories in that process. How does that affect your faith?
Well, it's funny. I had this conversation with our senior pastor, David Storer, a while ago. And I have the best job in the world because I see miracles. There's not a week that goes past that I don't see miracles. And it almost feels like I don't have faith. Now, I have to try and put that in context because I tangibly see God heal people. You know, people say, oh, gee, you're so great. But sometimes, I just sit there, really, and watch God do his stuff. And miracles happen, I'm so privileged. And, people come and see me and they're without hope. And we talked about homosexuality, and a few weeks ago I had a young man referred to me, and he just felt hopeless because, the wrench that was going within him, because on the one hand he loved God, he really loved God, but he was, involved in homosexual relationships.
Wow.
And just felt so locked into it, thought that he was born this way. And, I just, told him about the genetic thing and, and gave him some homework. And, when, I pray for everybody I work with, and I thought, And he said, "Oh, I'll come back next week." And I was thinking, I don't know. And I said, "Lord, I don't know what to do. That's it. I've done all I know to do now." And he came back the next week, and when I opened the door, he looked different.
Wow.
Like he just looked different. And he came in the door and grabbed hold of me and just, went ballistic. And he was absolutely set free. Now, I did nothing, really. I didn't know. I just watched, really.
Wow.
And that happens not all the time. But, sometimes people have to come several times. But, it's just... God is so good. If people want to change and they're seeking, He's there.
Wow.
And they do the homework and they get well. And it's so look. It's there are difficult aspects to what I do. I have to listen to some stuff that's difficult to hear. I cry, but I cry sometimes tears of joy as well. So it's. God called me to do this, and I will continue to do it until He says that's it, because it's the best job in the world. I'm very privileged.
Dr. Pastor Legend Dee DuCrow, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us. Come on, let's stand to our feet and just honour and thank both Dr. Dee and also Michael this morning.